We'll start off with a poem to orient us for the theme of today, how not to be an individual as we face the climate crisis. And this poem I first heard, I think, many years ago when I was at Central Congregational Church in Jamaica Plains neighborhood of Boston. And I just remember at the time loving the poem and also being amazed that someone said the word sex in a church. I was a young seminarian at the time, so get ready. That word is in this poem. So the poem is "The Low Road" by Marge Piercy. What can they do to you? Whatever they want. They can set you up, they can bust you, they can break your fingers, they can burn your brain with electricity, blur you with drugs till you can't walk, can't remember. They can take your child, wall up your lover. They can do anything you can't stop them from doing. How can you stop them? Alone you can fight, you can refuse, you can take what revenge you can, but they will roll over you. But two people fighting back to back can cut through a mob. A snake dancing file can break through a cordon. An army can meet an army. Two people can keep each other sane, can give support, conviction, love, massage, hope, sex. Three people are a delegation, a committee, a wedge. With four, you can play bridge and start an organization. With six, you can rent a whole house, eat pie for dinner with no seconds, and hold a fundraising party. A dozen make a demonstration, 100 fill a hall, 1,000 have solidarity in your own newsletter, 10,000 power in your own paper, 100,000 your own media, 10 million your own country. It goes on one at a time. It starts when you care to act. It starts when you do it again and they said no. It starts when you say we and know you know who you mean, and each day you mean one more. So we can reflect upon that poem in relationship to our theme for today. The plan today is to hear from our three guest panelists. I'm going to introduce them to you one at a time in the order that they'll be speaking. First up, we will have Reverend Angel Luis Rivera-Agosto, Executive Minister for Latin America and the Caribbean for Global Ministries. He's known well throughout the United Church of Christ and the Disciples of Christ. Uh, he, he immediately occurred to us as on our planning committee for this webinar because his reputation precedes him as being someone who has an ear and grounding in the grassroots and in communal collective efforts in the struggle for justice. And so we are delighted to have him with us. He will be followed by Garret Barnwell, a clinical psychologist and researcher focused on environmental justice in South Africa. He has a master's degree in clinical psychology and conflict transformation and management from Nelson Mandela University, as well as a diploma in humanitarian assistance through Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine. He has a wide range of professional experiences, including serving as the deputy head of mission for Doctors Without Borders, as well as work with mine affected communities in Rustenburg. And so he is joining us from South Africa today. The Reverend Sam Chamelin is the founder of the Keep and Till Farm Church, a new church that he planted, and it's centered on spiritual formation, ecology, and agriculture. And he also has an excellent podcast called Food and Faith. I will drop a link to that in the chat box momentarily. And then, if that weren't to keep him busy enough, he is also the pastor at St. Mary's UCC in Westminster, Maryland. And so we're delighted to have all three of these panelists with us today. And we will get started with Angel Luis Rivera-Agosto.
Greetings, everybody. It is a pleasure to be with you all. Thank you, Brooks, for the invitation. And I am very delighted to be sharing along with Sam and Garret and all of the people that are participating into this dialogue. And you know, for me it was so intriguing and kind of a challenge to respond to that phrase that Brooks shared with me at the moment of his invitation. Uh, this phrase saying, not not being an individual, you know, become less of an individual, come together and push for solutions, by Bill McKibben, when he is asked regarding what can we do about climate change. So on that regard, I want to share some thoughts, some notes regarding what does it mean to not being an individual, and seen from the biblical and theological perspective, uh, who is our neighbor. Notes on how to shift from hyper individualism to communal reflection and practice. And I'm going to be sharing uh, a PowerPoint presentation. Uh, so let me put it like here. Okay, I have this friend first. Okay, this is the first illustration. You're thy neighbor. Notes on how to shift from hyper-individualism to communal reflection and praxis. And Supreme Court Justice Samuel Alito expressed recently in a speech he delivered during an event sponsored by the Federalist Society's annual convention this phrase that you can see in your screens. The pandemic, COVID-19 pandemic, has resulted in previously unimaginable restrictions to individual liberty. And even though he tried to clarify that he's not questioning restrictions as they could represent good public policy, he's very much worried about the consequences of recent policies by states regarding the pandemic and how they can affect our own individual liberties. So he was a prophet because maybe 2 weeks after his comment, the Supreme Court, the U.S. Supreme Court, delivered this opinion that you can see in the presentation, Roman Catholic Diocese of Brooklyn versus Cuomo. And that decision, the court decided regarding the enforcement of Governor Cuomo's severe restrictions of the applicant's religious services to be enjoined. That is to say, the Roman Catholic Diocese of Brooklyn, as well as some other Jewish community, can meet and can have their own religious services, even though there is a high percentage of contagions in New York City and in the state of New York. So when we see things like this, and I have to be honest with you, uh, I just couldn't understand how the Supreme Court got into that decision, shifting away from two previous cases where the Supreme Court respected the criteria, the scientific and medical criteria from the states. Uh, Judge Sonia Sotomayor, in the dissenting opinion, said, and she was clear in terms of the enforcement of those restrictions uh, are important in terms of how to limit the different policies, how to respect the different policies as used by the states, because they were getting into similar activities. So lectures, concerts, movie showings, spectator sports, and theatrical performance are very much like our religious communities. They gather by large groups of people in close proximity for extended periods of time. So those policies try to make decisions to protect the public safety and the health of the people, depending on the characteristics of those activities. So now the religious communities can gather regardless of the regardless of the state's decisions in terms of scientific and medical information in terms of their own gatherings on the possibilities of contagions there. So um, beyond my own worries on how the United States and society continues to embrace some sort of a mythical, idolatric sense of religious service and religious practice, I think that we should focus on the issue of hyper-individuality, discussions, reflections, and even policies that are mostly framed into competing and individual interest at stake. So individual freedom to buy a beer or to go to places, individual right to religious belief or the right to speech or to acquire property, the individual fulfillment of the so-called American dream. I think that we need to be very much aware of how we frame our own discussions here in the US regarding individual freedoms. So as we refer into this phrase, becoming less of an individual, uh, I cannot, I need to link that with this other question. Who is my neighbor? Who is this other person that I have the opportunity to live with? The Bible says, love God and love thy neighbor as yourself. But then I want to frame the discussion in terms of, uh, of the Jewish philosopher Emmanuel Levinas, who gives us an alternative concept of neighbor. According to Levinas, the correct translation of that biblical phrase is, love your neighbor, you are thy neighbor. And the same idea can be expressed in the phrase popularized by Desmond Tutu, and you can see the phrase in the screens. I am if you are too. I am if you are. We are. And also, it is very easy to find similar formulations among indigenous cultures in Latin America and the Caribbean, and specifically in the book Bocas del Tiempo, Mouths of Time by Eduardo Galeano. He referred to an experience he had among Celtal indigenous communities in the southeastern Mexico, in Chiapas, Mexico, as he heard this word tick, the word tick. And he described that as kind of as a rainfall, as he was hearing the indigenous communities gathered in meetings saying tick, 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 tick. And it's very interesting because as we, as our languages and traditional languages are very more focused on the I terms, I have needs, I have been living very difficult times in this COVID-19 pandemic. I feel stressed. I am missing learning opportunities. I am not doing X or Y. I am so much affected. That beautiful rain coming from the Mexican southeast is saying to us the word we, because the Celtales, they don't have the word I in their language. When they refer to themselves, they refer as we, as we. So that's very interesting, and it is a challenge. And as simple as it is complex, we cannot go on mere being individuals because the reality, the identity, the general essence is ours. We are a single, inseparable thing in such a way that all human behavior, action, and commitment needs to be social. It has to take into account that common identity between my neighbor and myself. So where is your brother? Where is your brother? Ask God to Cain as he killed his brother Abel. I think that that is very much important. And along with that, I have to quote the German Costa Rican theologian Franz Hinkelhammer when he said that every murder is a suicide. Every murder is a suicide. The bullet that you could shoot from your gun will go around the world and will kill you from behind because we're in a globalized society. So, so the reality is not linear, but global. Everything that you could do will affect you directly. So every murder can be a suicide. So I think it is very important for us to shift away from structures of competition, those structures that affirm the individual, and to go into affirming our well-being, avoiding affirming our own being based on the annihilation of the other, uh, shifting away from the neoliberal piety, as we are doomed to economic, ecological, and existential suicide. So this is an advice against the religion of the market. So we need to be careful, and we need to develop that awareness of the other, because we are our own neighbors. So our experiences working in global ministries, specifically in the Latin American, the Caribbean region, I can share with you how communities and churches practice that sense of community. For example, the Evangelical and Reformed Church in Honduras, they develop community enterprises for youth in a way to overcome poverty and marginalization. So in times of heavy migration from Central America to the north, this church affirmed the right of the people to stay, the right of families to raise their children in their own culture, history, and identity context. So it's very important how those communities in Honduras protect themselves and create those enterprises, those initiatives, so they can stay in the midst of migration in Central America. Another experience that I can share with you is the one from the Ecumenical Foundation for Integral Development, Education, and Capacity Building, FEDICE, in Ecuador. They uh, provide soft loans to indigenous entrepreneurs so that they can feed their community, the communal economies, matching the use of the legal currency in the country to the barter economies in the highlands of Ecuador. So it's very important how they use the capitalist economy, and they transform the economy so that economy could then feed the barter economy, so they can benefit and put a more communal profit for the benefit of the community. That is very interesting, the way the indigenous people in Ecuador deal with the economy, so the economy can be transformed to serve the whole community. I can also refer to the experience of the Christian Mission Church in Nicaragua, and how they put efforts towards environmental protection and education. The work that they do includes confronting climate change, facilitating workshops on sustainable agriculture techniques, and also educating community members about the importance of being environmental stewards. And one of the initiatives they have is the physical construction and maintenance of seed banks across the whole country. So that is also very interesting, how these seed banks provide the basic food, so they can guarantee the food for communities even during periods of drought. At this moment, even they have been working in the midst of the passing of Hurricane Eta and Iota through Nicaragua, providing food, medicines, first aid kits, and temporary roofs for the shattered homes. So we affirm a new amanecer, a new dawn. An amanecer is kind of a playing with the word dawn and amanecer in Spanish, but amanecer with S put the emphasis on the being, on a new being for a new dawn. So the Alliance for Sustainable Resources Management in Puerto Rico work in that sense. Amanecer 2025 walk alongside communities developing community self-management projects based on energy sovereignty and the use of solar technology to provide security regarding electric service on the island. But I want to make an emphasis on some of the sayings by Juan Rosario, the executive director of Amanecer 2025. When we refer to the project, he says that they are not merely installing solar equipments, because there's a lot of people in Puerto Rico doing that, even offering those systems at a very good price. But instead of installing solar equipment, what he says is that they're there to promote the installation of new systems of thought, installing new praxis, installing new ways of seeing life out of community effort and accompaniment. So through community meetings, they train themselves on how to install the equipment, how to provide maintenance into them, how to consult between themselves in terms of better practices to work with their solar systems, and how to look for each other, especially through hurricane seasons in the island. So not being an individual is equivalent to be aware of how we are our neighbors, and that every murder could be a suicide. So we cannot live marginalized from the needs, hopes, and dreams from our neighbors. Everything is interconnected. Everything is part of a whole, and we need to develop humbleness and recognition of our own vulnerabilities and needs to embrace reality along with others. Communities in Latin America and the Caribbean can testify of that notion of life amid adverse situations. Let us continue installing new systems of thought and praxis among our communities. So, thanks for the opportunity, and may God bless you all. Que Dios les continúe bendiciendo. Thank you. Gracias.
Thank you so much for that terrific presentation and getting us off and running. We will now transition to our second presentation from Garret Barnwell.
Can you see the presentation?
We can. You'll want to make it full screen, I think, if you can.
Okay, great. Like that?
Yep, looks great.
Great. Okay. So thanks for really just thank you for the invite. And I'm sorry that it's a bit dark. I'm in the northern part of South Africa at the moment, and the light's a bit dim. But what I'll do, just to pick up from Reverend Rivera-Agosto, what stood out to me with what he was saying was this idea of praxis. So doing action, and through that action, transforming yourself and reflecting on that action. And what I'm going to present is, so I'm a clinical psychologist, but I've adopted a bit of a community psychology approach, and quite an influence, actually, funny enough, by liberation psychology, which has its roots in Latin America. And I think Martin Barrow, for instance, was a Catholic priest. And yeah, so this presentation, what I want to do is just speak a bit about praxis, but through our relationship with place. And I'll share some experiences here from South Africa. So I want to start off with just a quote, and this is from Thomas Berry, the philosopher, and also, if I'm correct, Catholic priest. And he speaks about, so Thomas Berry was incredibly influential on the rights of nature. So not only seeing human beings as having inherent rights to live, exist, and flourish, but also for the rest of the more than human world. So not only when we're thinking about the neighbor as being the person next to us, but we can also think about the more than human communities. And basically what Thomas Berry says is rights originate where existence originates. And I want to keep that as we move forward in the front of our minds. So I'm based within a very specific context with very kind of influential struggles of the past because of, so here in South Africa, we were liberated from the apartheid regime in 94. And those, I think everyone in this call probably knows who this person is. This is our former president, Nelson Mandela. And what I want to present to this picture through this is he was, as a person, he wasn't an individual, but he was actually influenced by a number of other people. And what Reverend was speaking about before, also internationality as well. So here you had, in South Africa, you had the Tripartite Alliance, so the African National Congress was the main, and is in power at the moment, the political party. You had the SACP, and you also had this alliance between unions. So very kind of complex struggle in South Africa. You also had internationality. So that person in the middle at the bottom, that's actually a picture of Nelson Mandela when he was in Algeria, trying to get support for the struggle in South Africa. It's not only about, so these practical relationships were also influenced by really progressive political thought. So on the top right, you have Frantz Fanon, who was a psychiatrist working within the liberation movement in Algeria. And you also have Paulo Freire, the Brazilian pedagogist, the educationist, who very much kind of articulated ideas of praxis, doing and transforming society through doing in solidarity with one another. And they very much influenced in this network the Black consciousness leader in South Africa, Steve Biko, who's there at the bottom right. And I just wanted to portray that because sometimes we see activists as these single figures, and actually there's this whole complexity of thought and processes that go alongside, and I think really important. So for instance, many of you are from America, in the USA, and how the US also played a role, at least civil society, in the boycott of the apartheid regime. So there's been struggles in the past, really important struggles that have had international impact. And then also it wasn't only these kind of figureheads. This was the photo from the Soweto uprising. It was people like you and me in South Africa, predominantly Black South Africans fighting for the struggle, and also people of color. Today, so we have a democracy today in South Africa, but there's still continuations of certain dynamics that we're challenging in the country. So for instance, mining in many ways are the new kind of colonial outposts. So we've got strong kind of resistance movements in terms of mining. And this photo is from a community at the coast called Olobeni. And they recently, through kind of making a case with this relationship to land and ancestral linkages to land, but also saying that, okay, tourism's important, our farming, sustainable farming is important, the climate crisis that we're heading towards, we'd rather like a sustainable future, and we want to say no to mining. So that's a bit of a broad context about what's going on in a very, very short space of time. But you've got these struggles happening throughout South Africa. And I see them almost like trees, and maybe throughout the world. And on the surface, they seem quite disconnected at times. But really, if you look below the surface, I think it's very much what the previous speaker was talking about, is moving away from this individuality to really a sense of connectivity. These emergent thoughts, these emergent relationships that counter a certain narrative and that very much objectify the more than human world. So I'm going to touch on one of these, and I'm actually in the area at the moment, in the northern part of South Africa on the Zimbabwean border. You have a place called Vembe. And at the moment, I'm here on the right-hand side at a place called Lake Fundutsi. And in that area, you've got a number of really important sites that have been there over generations and really important for the transference of community identity. Sacred spaces in whether they be forests, lakes, waterfalls, or mountains, for instance. What had happened, though, was in the 1940s, the apartheid regime consolidated a lot of its power through the extraction of mineral resources and also the conversion of land for to basically gain power. It also used some of its policies. So, for instance, in South Africa, we had racial segregation, which was used then by racial capitalism to move people off of their land to exploit the land. So it's a narrative that's not often spoken about, but you see it throughout South Africa, how these land conversions and oppressive systems often go hand in hand. This is not a photo of South Africa, but I want to give a bit of a scale because I didn't have a good photograph. But I'm thinking about, so the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity Systems released a report, I think it was in 2019, where they quoted that 3/4 of the world's surface has been transformed already. And just to get us kind of, the scale is massive. And if we think about the climate crisis, it's intimately connected to how we relate to land and how we're going to relate to land in the future. So that praxis with land is going to be is already incredibly important. This is one of the sacred sites, so Lake Fundutsi. Many people rely on the area for livelihood functions, fishing from the area, obtaining wood from the area for crafts and so forth. But it's incredibly beautiful and a lot of endemic species. That's just a photo. I was walking through the forest and it's absolutely magnificent. You have a type of really rich biodiversity. That's the Samango monkey. I'm just like showing you pictures of animals and stuff, but to try and just give you an idea of how incredible this place is. So while there was a lot that was transformed in the area in terms of land and what was established in this place was stuff like tea farms for the international economy, forestry industries for the local and international economy, agriculture for the local and international economy. You also have a resurgence as well that is very much rooted in the relationship to place. So for instance, one of the grassroots, and there's a couple of these type of grassroots organizations across South Africa. One of them is called Dzomalamupo, which means the voice of nature. And they formed a couple of years ago in 2007. I've been working with them for about 2 years now. And what they've really done is not only working, and I'll give a couple of examples, not only working on this praxis with land, but also cultural resurgence coming from this relationship with land. So during apartheid, what happened was the land conversions really unsettled community identity. And it's been through the reconnection with the relationship with land that community bonds have been strengthened. So a key thing and something to think about, I always think about what would be some of the lessons learned. Simple shared projects. So creates a sense of identity. So for instance, one of the key activities is seed sharing. It forms a relationship to place. You also get to know more about the ecology, but also the sense of giving to one another and sharing in a kind of activity and stuff creates a group identity. You also, there's so much here about language, recuperation of language, ways of cooking and so forth. But I think some of these kind of shared activities can be adapted to other settings. Another one as well, which is not only example here, but if you think about a person called Wangari Maathai, she also really pushed something called the Greenbelt movement, which was replanting trees in East Africa, is tree nurseries. So the community will come together and grow, go collect seeds from the forests, plant them, nurture the saplings and stuff until they at the age where they can be planted. And they're busy reforesting some of the areas and creating a buffer from the pine plantations and so forth. Here's another one, and they kind of scattered all around the community and stuff, and they're trying to get this model sustainable now as well. But I thought that it's really interesting. One of the quotes from research that I've done here is that, if I remember the one quote correctly, is that the person said that she formed a love with this process of planting the trees and stuff, and it has a kind of, again, that same kind of experience of socialization. So I get to meet other people through these kind of activities. So I'm really being quite concrete, but these kind of hands-on things are so important for what we create. The other thing, unfortunately, the sense of extractivism hasn't ended. So in 2 years ago, we were notified that there were mineral prospecting happening in the area. And we managed to work with local media. I managed to access the prospecting licenses, and we worked with local media to raise awareness about this and kind of connecting it to the identity of place. And the Dzomalamupo, what they did was they lobbied very strongly with local leadership, and the mine prospecting was overturned. Other things as well is thinking about how do you incorporate land into dialogue. So if you're thinking about, here I want to end a bit on the rights of nature, but how, if we are thinking about a land-based praxis or thinking about our relationship to the more than human world, how do we bring that voice out in our discussions? How do we think actively about not only our interests, so for instance, our health, if there was a mining project, how do we think about the interests of other communities? So some of these, in the background, you have one of the sacred sites called Magoro, where people get traditional medicine from, and also burial sites and so forth. So the dialogue's taking place at these sites. So being quite cognizant of how you incorporate place into dialogue. And this dialogue was basically with the Heritage Resource Agency. So what we've been trying to do is really challenge the colonial perspective of heritage, which would be, as soon as it's declared a heritage site, it becomes a tourism site and so forth. And the kind of spirit of place is very devalued. And what Somalamupo are trying to head towards is probably more what you see in other areas, for instance, in Latin America, where, sorry, I'm all right there, the globe just broke, is to, really push for the sanctity of place to be recognized. So part of that process has been these kind of eco-psychosocial reports. So also like what the previous speaker was saying, is not focusing on the harm or the per se, but focusing on, for instance, well-being and a generative kind of approach. So these eco-psychosocial reports, while it's a recollection of traumas of the past, it's really focuses more on the relationship to place and the importance of place in terms of well-being. And these are used, being used for the motivation of better protections. So that's it. And just because the previous speaker mentioned neoliberalism, this is a question posed by Mary Watkins, who wrote a book called Mutual Accompaniment and the Creation of the Commons. She's got a beautiful chapter on earth accompaniment. And she says, and maybe to leave you with this question is, how can I live in deeper solidarity with the natural world at this perilous moment in our history? And also affected, recognizing the kind of systems that drive harm in many places in the global south and the souths of the global north. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. Yeah, terrific. I'm glad you survived the falling of your optical equipment there. We will now transition to the Reverend Sam Chamelin, and I can see how all these presentations are building upon each other. I'm anticipating yours will dovetail nicely with that. So.
Now I'm unmuted. So yeah, I thought for a second I was never so happy to go last as I was today, and then I do hear these building, and I'm not sure that I'm necessarily the best person to go last, but I am grateful to be here with everyone, and for Angel and for Garret and for the way and for that which you've challenged us with. Thank you so much. So I don't know that I necessarily belong here, but it's okay because I can at least share a story about what matters to me and where I come from. My vocational call is to rural ministry. Has been since I felt a call to ministry, and it has always been about what contributions rural people can contribute to the wider conversations that we are a part of. It had always seemed to me that my background, which is in dairy farming and a robust faith, I grew up going to church. I never had that moment where I hated church or left the church. Church always made sense to me, and it always made sense in the context of the way that my family lived its life, which was a multi-generational dairy farm. And it always seemed that those two things were intertwined, which certainly speaks to why I feel so close to rural ministry. And so I've always been trying to think about what is it that we contribute? What is it that rural folks who are participating in agriculture can contribute to the conversations that we're having? The three answers I keep coming back to are a meaningful sense of community, food insecurity, and land care. And that is why I ultimately started the Keep and Till, because I wanted to put those three things at the center of a community of faith and just see what happens. And I think that far too often, too many rural churches ignore one of the greatest gifts that they have, which is access to soil. It doesn't make us better churches, and it doesn't make us special Christians. It just means that we have more access, and therefore there is a special charism that perhaps we have. And I wanted to pay attention to that as a pastor. And so at the Keep Until, our conviction is that God's first revelation is in the land, so engaging with that land will form us. And the fundamental principle behind what we do is that engaging with the earth is a critical component of spiritual formation, which is my job and my call as a pastor. And that as we engage with the earth, it will shape us in peculiar and necessary ways that will drive us to practice a holistic and justice-oriented spirituality in an Anthropocene era. And so I was trying to think out, as a pastor, what are 3 things that I could do to not be an individual and create a community that is not all that invested in individual Christianity? What is it that we can do? And so it seemed to me that the place we begin are with the texts. Because I am a pastor, and because spiritual formation is my vocational commitment and calling, I believe that our faith communities always and everywhere have to start with the stuff that has been handed down to us. It was Jonathan Wilson Hartgrove who told me that it was Eugene Peterson who told him. He said, there is a river. He said, we inherit that which comes before us, and we will send downstream some things that we have learned and we can pass on. And so what is it that we've inherited? Well, we've inherited these texts, these stories, and these rituals. But too often we look past those texts to try to figure out what it is that we ought to be doing in the world, when actually, and maybe the texts still have something really foundational important to say to us. We have to learn, again, to read our texts, both canonical texts and our own personal stories, from the perspective of we, not me. And this has been a theme throughout today's presentations. Our texts, we hold our texts sacred because they have been found authoritative in some way for the work of exposing our failure, exposing what is broken in the world, expanding our imagination of what is possible in the world, and ultimately inviting us into a more just and generous future. That's what makes our texts sacred. They tell us something about the brokenness of the world and where the world is headed. And they are foundational, which means they carry deep, if often unforeseen, influences. And so as we read our texts, so shall we live. We cannot escape the ways that we read and proclaim the texts. And we will live in the ways that we proclaim this text, both in our rituals and in our service and in our wider witness. Now, what seems to be unique to American Christians, or at least especially American Christians with backgrounds and people who look like me, is that we've been late to the climate change party because we have read our texts primarily and overwhelmingly individually. So our piety and salvation we conceive as primarily and fundamentally individual. We see this play out in rural communities because in these spaces that we say have a certain kind of spirituality, farmers have been late to the climate change party because they have chosen this kind of Lone Ranger approach to what they do. And they've done that because they often believe it to be virtuous. Or they've been forced by economic and social forces to go that way. So either we've chosen it because we believe it's virtuous, or we've been forced to by social realities that have pushed us to the margins. And so when this happens, we have this way of applying individual solutions to community concerns, which is exactly what we see when we tell folks to recycle and drive less. Those things are not unimportant, but they're definitely not sufficient in terms of addressing the climate change issues that we face as a society. And in this way, American mainline Protestantism has indeed been what it has often claimed to be, which is a chaplain to the culture. Which means it has blessed a mindset, a way of reading our texts individually that makes systemic change impossible, which is to the great benefit of those who sit in power. But our texts are fundamentally agrarian. And ask a farmer and they will tell you how much the land shows up when maybe we don't often see it. What do we mean by agrarian? That word is weighty and it has a lot of issues around it. The way that I want to use the word agrarian is simply that we understand the land as a moral partner. As Wendell Berry describes agrarian, he says, agrarian simply means that we start with the givens. We start with what is already present. We start with land. We start with water, air, the flora and fauna that we find ourselves, the microbiology that is there. And yes, for us as believers, we believe that God is present there also. And so if our scriptures are agrarian, then they are always and everywhere about us, which includes the created order, One might say that our faith is only and best understood in the context of ecosystems, not in individuals. And when we read the text this way, we start to see our collective failings. We start to expand our collective imagination, and we find that we all are invited into a more just and generous future. And in this way, our prayers follow suit, our sacraments follow suit, and indeed it is no accident that the most sacred act we hold as Christians is a meal that at the center of it includes 2 agricultural products. So we need a renewal of the act of proclamation. We must be intentional to preach from a perspective, to use my language, the language I grew up with, a perspective of y'all and not you. Because when we say you, what we hear, we default to the individual. But our most generational impact, hear that again, our most generational impact in faith communities will come as we simply teach folks to reimagine the scriptures as a communal document, embracing not just what a small section of the people of God, but rather the entire created cosmos. As we allow those stories to shape us, the next thing we do at Keep Until is simply try to experience community and come out of our individual mindset by sharing work. At Keep Until, most of our spirituality is played out just by running a community garden. Now, here is where I sense my individualism the most. If you'll permit me for a minute, I will tell you that I am the best gardener at K&T, which means it would be super easy for me to just go ahead and do the gardening myself. I'm the one who knows what to do, and I can do it quickly. Watch me weed a row. All right, Lord gave me big hands, and I can fly through a row. We can get this weeding done ASAP. We have people who participate in this who not only don't know how to garden, and they also don't know where their food comes from, but they don't even do their own shopping, so they don't even know what a harvestable head of broccoli looks like. This just happened to me this past week. We're trying to close up our garden. It's autumn, almost winter here in the mid-Atlantic, and so I get a picture from a friend of mine who's out harvesting, and he says, does this piece of broccoli, which was about the size of a quarter, should we go ahead and harvest this? And I'm like, no, that head is going to grow that head's going to grow a lot. Let it be. He didn't even know that that was the appropriate size to buy a head of broccoli, like many of us might. And so it would be easy for me to just say, go ahead, you know what, I'm just going to go in and I'm going to do it. But community stories and texts, they bring our people to the garden, and then once there, we try to be intentional about practicing equality and shared labor in the garden with patience and with grace. For us, it started really clumsily and badly. We've been through a lot of garden iterations and we've messed a lot of things up. But that's because we allowed people to fail as they learned what gardening looks like and as they learned to pay attention to what's important in the garden and the ecosystem that we find there. And only now, 4 years into this, is our garden starting to show some really quality produce with a little bit of beauty mixed in as well. Skills are developing, stories are forming, which means we're growing a team of evangelists who can now speak to larger realities out of their own experiences. And in doing this, in sharing work together, we've discovered, forgive my office phone that's ringing now. In doing so, we discovered as we share this work, we also discover that we are part of a larger community, not only a community of faith, but we start to understand the stories of food producers locally, nationally, and globally. And then as we donate our food to food pantries, we start to discern a much larger community there as well. Reading our text communally means we start to discern our community better. And I've stopped hearing there's no poor around here. Why does this work need to get done? And we've started saying, how did so many poor get here? And that's been a revelation for our community. We've started to orient ourselves in a larger story, one that discerns the neighborhood and discerns the times that we find ourselves in. And so if we fail to do that, if we don't do this work together and discern the larger community, then we are just going to be that weird little garden church thing that people who like to hug trees likes to go hang out at. But if we discern that larger story, then other people will say, well, wait a second, there is something going on about the way they're connecting to the earth and the way that connection to the earth, inspired by their faith, is actually driving them to the community. And then the last thing, just in how not to be an individual, as we have practiced this as a community, that we've often discovered this. I've known this since we started, but there's a sneaky little secret that our gardening has never really been about the food. We talk about food a lot, and food insecurity is an issue, but it's not an issue for the ways that we often think about it. Food in this country is not in short supply. I don't know that it has been since the Dust Bowl, to be honest. And healthy food, which we often say, People have trouble getting healthy food. Even healthy food is not in short supply. The agricultural community will tell you we throw away 40% of the produce that we create in this country. What is in short supply is the moral and spiritual formation around the purpose of food, what is food about, and who has access to it. That is what we lack. Indeed, for keep until, there's often this sense of letdown when we call up food pantries and say, hey, we've got all this food that we love to donate, and we actually get turned down, or people say, well, we don't know what to do with that. There's this sense of letdown, and everybody's going, well, if they're so full of food, why are we growing this food in the first place? And once that question gets asked, we discover that our farming shows us the issue really isn't food shortage. It's systemic issues about who has access to food and why. The real questions we're asking is why we continue to permit environmental degradation, and why environmental degradation seems to impact those people more than these people over here. We start to see how environmental realities affect us differently. It's why we permit poverty in areas like mine, where people who work incredibly hard and yet cannot make a living, farmers who look like me, all of a sudden they're going, well, why are they working so hard? And they're not making money. What is the matter with our economic systems? Now we're starting to think about larger issues. And we can see that being formed in our stories and then being formed in our work together has finally brought us to the place where we're no longer thinking about spiritual issues in an individual way. We're no longer thinking about our issues like food insecurity in individual ways. We start to realize that these are deeply interconnected issues, as Garret has already shared very, very well. And slowly but surely, in the words of our scriptures, we are becoming the ones with ears, and I'm trying to get them to hear. And so what can we do as churches to not be individuals in the work of climate change? Well, we need to do what it is we've always done in so many ways. To proclaim the good news, to do our work together, and to ask larger questions. This spiritual pathway that we've discovered as we are a farm church has dropped us off at a place where it's impossible for us to imagine that it's my job individually to solve climate change. My light bulbs aren't going to solve climate change. My water usage isn't going to solve climate change. My driving habits aren't going to solve climate change. It is only our responsibility together. That was presented before. Desmond Tutu said, I am if you are too. That is the way we will address these issues. And it is our job as followers of Jesus, people in faith communities, to be formed and to pray and to think in these ways. And so this drops me off at the place where there are two realities that we can think about as faith communities going forward. In order to not move individually, we need pastors and faith leaders. People who are called by the Almighty, by the Creator, and trained to tend to the community, to be robust practitioners of agriculture. Congregations must feel the soil in which God has so wisely placed Microbacterium vaccae, which appears when we stick our hands in the soil. These microbacteria, they stimulate serotonin production in humans and give us a picture of a better world. We need faith leaders who know the joy that is in the soil, to discern the community that's built on top of that soil, and then discern the systemic issues that are present there and meet that with our own faith traditions. And then further, we need to trust that this kind of earth-based spirituality is hiding out in places that we didn't expect. Because land is central to the people of God, we need to hear from those who are living close to the land and who have robust theologies of land. Often we look down on people who live close to the land. We need to not do that in so many ways. In fact, we need to sit at their feet and listen very closely. These people aren't necessarily special. I'm thinking about the people I grew up with. My grandparents, my great-grandparents, the dairy farmers that we hung out with, were not the smartest people in the world, but they have a contribution to make, like everyone else around the table. We don't need everyone to be a farmer, but we do need to create spaces where practitioners of agriculture, and in particular regenerative agriculture, can be full-throated participants in our social, economic, and moral conversations. And so the only way that we will move forward in an Anthropocene era is if the church has a message, if the church proclaims a faith that can get us through and and can engage the problems that we find in climate change. And so faith is not tangential to this era of climate change. It will be central to it. And we need to be thinking carefully about our churches, both new and established, and think about how we can proclaim a faith that will meet those challenges head on with the stories of our faith and with the gifts that have been handed down to us, and creating gifts that we can hand on to the generation that comes after us. I don't think I was under 10 minutes, but I tried real hard.
Thank you so much, Sam. We have had 3 terrific panelists today. Very grateful to all 3 of you. We are up against the end of our time today, so I do want to respect that. I think, you know, what we can do is I'll wrap things up, and then if those of you who have time and want to hang out a little while longer to discuss the chat, we can do that as well. But I do want to respect people's time. And first, just to say in wrapping up that this has been, I think, terrific for us. Often our focus, for those of us focused on climate justice, is either what's really going really wrong or what are the policy solutions, and not so much kind of the bridge of how we come together collectively to move from what's really wrong to what should be really right. And you know, I think we live at a time when even, you know, among the activists of the climate movement, we excel at what's been called click activism, right? We're good at being at our computers as individuals and clicking on a, you know, sending an email to our legislator, or clicking on a like on Facebook, or, you know, doing all of these things which we just do all by ourselves. And so really grateful that the 3 of you have kind of been a break from our kind of normal discourse as we talk about and think about climate justice, and have challenged us to think and act in new ways. And so thanks so much to all 3 of you. I recognize that you two also may need to, all of you may need to move on with your day, but I do want to give a chance if anybody is just burning with a comment or a question, we can feel free to put it in the chat box or in the Q&A.
Yeah, I can hang for a while if folks want to hang out.
Great.
Yeah, I can be for a little longer. Yeah, sure.
All right, terrific. All right. You know, I'll just ask a question real quick as people type in their questions into the Q&A or the chat box. You know, are there any practical recommendations that you would have, like for how to form community? Because we, you know, how do we move from the click activist to the tick activist, you know, the we activist? I mean, what are there practical things that we can do to move in that direction? Any thoughts on that?
I would jump. Yeah, I think that crisis, the sense of crisis, and the ways we read the times. For example, COVID-19. How can we learn to discern these specific times of COVID-19 crisis? How to use the pandemic as a tool to develop new perspectives, new readings of life, new readings of our context, new readings of our biblical and theological content, and new ways to develop a pastoral and prophetic approach into life. I think that in my experience, as I have been working through Latin America and the Caribbean, every time we have a crisis in different countries, for example, I can tell you about this actual crisis in Nicaragua and Honduras because of the hurricanes Eta and Iota. Our partners are gathering, are getting together, are experiencing new ways to work together, to respect nature, even to develop new ministries, developing awareness of climate change, of global warming, of environmental situations. So I think that crisis can be an excellent tool, if I can use some word, an excellent tool to discern new realities and new possibilities. Sometimes we even need crisis to get moving, because maybe we're so quiet, so calm into our everyday business, that then the crisis lift up our gifts, our talents, our possibilities, to looking back into the land, as Sam was sharing with us. Maybe we're so unaware of the own resources that we have in our own lands, that we're not aware of that. But then the crisis puts us back into the land, back into resources that we didn't consider before. So reading crisis, I think, is a very important element among others.
Can I add to that?
Yeah, go for it.
I think so what's been really interesting for me when I was working with Doctors Without Borders, we were confined to these kind of compounds in many places where we lived and stuff, and that whole idea of crisis kind of comes out, and how you stick together through these kind of challenging times and stuff. And so I saw it there. And then also recently with running groups on something called the Work That Reconnects. It's kind of the methodology for moving people through the feelings, the difficult feelings related to climate change and so forth, is food. So I like what Sam says is, it's maybe not about the food and what is it about, because we have this kind of plenitude or whatever. And what's been interesting for me, and just at a very basic kind of simple level, was not the massive process that we were holding about climate anxiety and so forth, but we created a space in the group midway where everyone would bring something kind of like a potluck, but it was quite intentional. So it would be something from someone's garden, and so forth. And it just created a very warm process that was really about the relationship. And it was funny, after a couple of weeks of running the group, that was the most important space that came out for everyone. The same as well, working in Somalia, was the way people kind of stuck together and managed through those moments where after work, being able to cook together, sit around a table together. So I think also these kind of simple processes as well, where we ground kind of this critical thinking in also a sense of giving and gratitude and sharing.
Thank you for that, Garret. Really appreciate those thoughts. We have a question from Tom Martinez that Sam would like to take a shot at. Tom says, we've become so alienated from the land here in the US. I love the idea of more gardening and hope the movement catches on. I'm also wondering, what other strategies are there to nurture a sense of connection to land? It seems there's an untapped history of a deep connection to the land that has been disrupted. And so, Sam, would you like to respond?
Yeah, I would. And thank you, Tom, for the question. It's a good one. But there are, one of the things we think about, okay, how can I engage with land? And all of us have things that will immediately come to mind, all of which are beautiful and wonderful things. So, so for some of us who don't have access to a great deal of soil, be like, hey, look, just having some plants in my house is a place to start. For others of us who can go somewhere, going on a hike, doing this idea of forest bathing and just allowing life to kind of wash over us. Those sorts of things can be deeply spiritually formative. But I still think it's important that we need to think. But one of the things that happens when we do those things only is we still draw a boundary between environment/creation and the human community. And this continues to be the issue, is that we are over and separated and apart from the ecosystems in which we find ourselves. That is the root of the problem. It's rooted in a domination theology that comes from a very unfortunate reading of Genesis chapter 1 and 2. And so we have to start thinking about, how is it that we draw our life from the actual land, which doesn't mean drawing entertainment or sort of comfort from it, but actually our life. And that is what is unique about agriculture. that agriculture actually says we actually have to draw food. We actually have to get sustenance from the land on which we find ourselves. And so how do we relate to that? And if we hurt that land, then we can't draw our actual life from it. And maybe this is the farmer in me, but I do want, while we do all these things, and I love hiking as much as the next person. I love going on long hikes. I ride my bike. I do all those sorts of things. I really do want to emphasize the production of food as a primary way that we interact with the environment as creatures who participate in ecosystems. And if we do that, then that begins, in Tom, your words, which are really well said, that begins to heal the rupture that we find. We actually have to think of ourselves as creatures in an ecosystem, and that changes our entire perspective. And that can start, and if we're struggling with that, then start by going a week by only eating what has been grown within 5 miles of your house. Just start there. Like, even if you can't grow your own food, start eating the food that is produced around you, and that will give you a real perspective about what the realities around the land that you actually find yourself on is. So all those things can be good. I still want to emphasize the production of food as an important part of understanding what it means to be part of an ecosystem.
Great. Thank you so much, Sam. I want to draw attention to one comment in the chat box. I think I'm trying to scroll back. This is a question coming from Heather. People may be coming from backgrounds where they've experienced authoritarian, countries and governments, and then be turned off by the idea of giving up personal freedoms. I mean, I think there's also a lot of people who in the United States who, who just are adverse to that and haven't had a recent experience with an authoritarian government outside of the United States who wouldn't want to hear about giving up personal freedoms. So is there any communication tips for talking about the, moving from an individualism type of approach to a more community collective oriented approach? Any ways of talking about that people that you would, with other people that you would recommend? Any thoughts?
I will jump again because I think that I was the one that referred more into that comment. I think that we need to be careful in terms of extremes, because with the fall of the Berlin Wall, there was an extreme that was kind of questioned in human history, but then after the Berlin Wall, our society has been moving into the other extreme, So first, we can criticize all of those authoritarian systems that didn't allow the human freedoms or liberties or whatever, and I think that was a part of the history of those countries, and I think that we kind of evolved from that place. But then the actual problem that we have is the one of hyper-individualism. Is the other extreme is to live our individual freedoms no matter how we affect our environment or our neighbor. So I think that it's a matter of getting into a right balance, respecting nature, respecting our neighbor, respecting social justice, building a just economy that could be democratic for everybody, not for a single class in the upper parts of society, and also to shift away from these utopias that want to function as perfect mechanisms, no market or no state or no whatever. No, I think that we need a combination of the best of everything getting together in order to achieve peace, prosperity, justice, and peace, So I think that this moment, the actual challenge is how can we control capitalism? How can we put strategic controls to this free market ideology? because if we continue this path, we are building into our own suicide as societies. We need to be very much aware of that. Capitalism can harm the worker and the nature. And we need to be very much careful on the extreme that we're living now. And we need to be careful because of thinking of an extreme anti-communism thought can then put us into the other extreme, and then not to evaluate the actual harm that we are suffering as societies. So I think it's a matter of being balanced. It's a matter of being contextual to the needs, specific needs of our people and the land and the creation, and how to build projects that could serve better, of course, respecting our freedoms, but also respecting the rights of nature and the rights of creation.
All right. Thank you for those. Yeah, go ahead.
Can I just have two thoughts in relationship to that. So in terms of language, I agree completely what was just said. And then in terms of language, this is actually where I find the rights of nature quite a useful tool, because the rights of nature says everything has a right to exist, create, and flourish. So a river has a right to flow, it has a right to nourish those around, and has a right to continue to exist across generations. And we in relationship with the more than human world, and we in relationship with one another. And I think that it's a way of quite concretely dismantling this kind of political dichotomy between different schools of thought in a way. The other thing is, just because it's recognizing the independence of a certain entity, like a river, like a tree, like a person, but also recognizing the interdependency on one another. And I definitely do agree with the class politics as well that we need to engage in now as well. And then there's a psychologist called Mary Watkins. She uses the word mutual accompaniment. And accompaniment, if I'm correct, also stemming from Latin America, from liberation theology. And that mutual accompaniment is seeing one another as interdependent kind of people. So you have your own kind of path, but you walking that path in solidarity with others. And I think that kind of language, being able to listen more deeply to others and the needs of others, but also recognizing that there is freedom within a relationship, but that freedom is interdependent, and we co-creating the future is a really important idea. My computer's about to go dead. I'm about to jump off.
All right, thank you very much, Garret. I think we are nearing probably the end of our time here. I think, I'll throw out one final question that we'll wrap up on, so I think the final question would be, given this conversation in light of the pandemic and the isolation it imposes upon us and the digital nature of our world today, do you see opportunities specifically through the use of online tools such as Zoom for creating community at this time in ways that would be relevant for our struggle for climate justice? Any thoughts on that? Would be greatly appreciated. And I would also just say, as I was listening also to the, I don't know, Luis, your comment about the suicide. I can't remember how you phrased it. Suicide being murder being a form of suicide. And I just the other day I was reading an In These Times article about suicide rates today being at, I think, 800% greater than they were before the pandemic. Yeah, and it just occurred to me that there's also a way in which suicide today is a form of murder. Or, that we've created a situation in our society where people are driven towards suicide, in a way, and so I don't think it's just the pandemic that's just to blame for that. um, so those are just thoughts, like how can we, within this moment, really make the most of striving for community, and making those opportunities available, uh, in the ways that we can.
Yeah. If I may, this whole thing reminds me of something I heard Luis said about using the crisis, and in our churches, using what presents itself, which is an agrarian way of going about faith. Like, what are the givens? What is right in front of us? And truth is, COVID's right in front of us. And it reminds me of a story in my first call, where when I was young and significantly dumber, I'd like to think I've gotten a little smarter over the years. I remember I used to get so frustrated at this very time of the year because there was this whole group of guys who would show up the last Sunday before Thanksgiving and tell me they weren't going to see me until Christmas because they were going hunting on Sundays, which used to drive me absolutely insane. And it felt a little passive aggressive that they were like, "Hey, we're not coming to church," and stick it in your ear. It finally occurred to me after a couple years to add, and they would always couch it in, "Well, I experienced God out there," and I used to roll my eyes and whatever. And it finally occurred to me a couple years later, and I was a little snarkier than I would be now. Be like, "Well, what does God say out there? I'm just interested to know." And what happened was I got the most beautiful stories of how people experience God just by watching the squirrels run across, by watching a beautiful buck that fortunately for the buck was too far away for them to shoot, listening to the water and sometimes the rain and if it would snow. I mean, if you've been in the snow, kind of the silence that accompanies the snow in the woods. And it occurred, using that which is in front of them opened up this entire conversation for what it means to experience God in all kinds of ways. COVID has done the exact same thing, in that I hear people who are locked inside, and I am one of them, say, "You know what, just going outside feels so darn good. Like, I just take my dog for a walk and it's the most spiritual moment of my day." Well, let's do the pastoral thing and just say, "Well, what do you experience out there? What's going on? Like, what conversations do you and your dog have?" Maybe that's not you. I talk to every animal I own. They're my best friends, so I'm used to talking to animals. But like, what happens? I ask my dairy farmers, what do you experience with the cows? And that in and of itself expands the religious imagination. All of a sudden it expands where we experience God. And if we're experiencing God out there, well, then it's sacred. And if it is sacred, then we ought to go with expectant ears. And so, again, coming back to what Angel said, like, we're sitting in the middle of a pandemic and people are telling us they are experiencing something healthy when they go outside. Let's pay attention to that. That's just good pastoral care. And it's one of the tools that have been in our toolbox for generations that we can pull out and use in a really powerful way today.
Great. Thank you for that. Any further response on here, Luis? You have anything you want to add, or?
No, I agree completely with Sam. We need to be aware. We need to be hearing, but hearing with our 2 ears. God gave us 2 ears and only 1 mouth to speak. So we need to listen more as pastors, as church leaders, as people in society. We need to hear what is going on around us, and to have the sensitivity to discern the elements that are among us, the use of time, the tools that we have at our disposal to like this exciting workshop. People are paying attention, are paying more attention. And I think that this is an excellent moment to build new alternatives. I remember Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico, and maybe like a week after Maria struck in Puerto Rico, I came to my own senses, because then I received a call from this environmental leader, Juan Rosario, telling me about the things that were happening in Puerto Rico at that time. And I remember us saying, this is the moment to begin this project that we have been dreaming for 15 years. Now is the moment to deal with awareness of solar systems, or solar energy in Puerto Rico, because now that people don't have electric energy, electric power, they will be more aware into thinking on the alternative of solar energy. And then the project was developed until today. And now here, now they're working in 6 different towns in Puerto Rico. So the project just grew up out of the need from Hurricane Maria. So the crisis brought the alternative and the things that they're working in Puerto Rico. So we need to be aware. We need to be hearing. We need to be careful on what people tell us, and to pray, and to listen to the stories in the Bible, as Sam shared with us before, and to be faithful and filled with hope, with faith and living hope.
All right. Thank you so much to all of our panelists and to everybody who's gathered with us today. It's a terrific experience. Next week, we will actually be having another webinar. I'll be joining forces with Michael Malcolm for our monthly Creation Justice webinar, and the theme will be the EPA in 2021, prioritizing moral accountability. As many of you might know, over 100 environmental protections have been rolled back or are in the process of being rolled back. And so what are we going to do about that in 2021? And in many ways, it connects to this subject. It might not seem like it on the surface, but you know, it's been the last 4 years have been let people do whatever they want, which has really meant let corporations do whatever they want while the rest of us suffer. And so so that will be an important time. We'll have some really terrific panelists for that, including someone from the Harvard Environmental Law Center that's been tracking all of those rollbacks. And so along with Vernice Travis Miller, who is part of the famous Sacred History of the UCC. She played a role in authoring the Toxic Waste and Race Report back in 1987. And so it'll be terrific slate of panelists. I'll put that in the chat box for people to check out. So thank you everybody for joining us, and thanks again to our panelists. Take care.